Now you understand that you've been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder?
Yes, I
Okay.
understand what you're saying.
And the charges are for murder in regards to both of your children. Okay? Now, I know that this is really tough for you.
Some of the darkest crimes in Canadian history weren't committed by strangers, drifters, or career criminals. They were committed by mothers. Women trusted to protect life, who instead took it. These are the stories that shake a nation because they defy everything we believe about love, instinct, and family. Across Canada, communities have struggled to process these tragedies. From quiet suburbs to small towns where neighbors still whisper the names. Each case forced the public to question not just how, but why. What could drive a mother to commit the unthinkable? Mental illness, desperation, revenge, or something much darker? In today's documentary, we'll look at the most shocking cases of Canadian mothers who crossed that line, and the ripple effects their actions left behind. Before we begin, I want to hear from you. Do you think there's ever a reason that can explain a mother taking the life of her own child? Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that force us to confront what evil truly looks like in Canada. Allyson McConnell, Millet, Alberta, February 2010. When Curtis McConnell pried open the locked bathroom door in his Millet home, the tub was still. 2 tiny forms, Connor, 2, and Jaden, 10 months, floated in the water. His wedding ring sat on the toilet lid beside them. Hours earlier, Edmonton police had called to say Allyson had been seriously injured after leaping from an overpass. No one knew where the boys were until their father walked into that room. Allyson, née Meagher, was an Australian who met Curtis in Canada. They married in 2007 and settled in Millet, south of Edmonton. Their first son, Connor, was born in 2007. Jaden arrived in 2009. By late 2009, the marriage had unraveled. Court filings and early news reports describe a custody dispute and Curtis's concern that Allyson might try to take the children to Australia, prompting him to secure the boys' passports. Between the final days of January and February 1st, 2010, Allyson drowned both children in the bathtub at the family home. The precise hour was never fixed at trial. Afterward, she drove to Edmonton, ate a meal, and then jumped from a roadway overpass, sustaining multiple fractures. An Edmonton officer phoned Curtis about Allyson's injuries. He returned to the house, forced the bathroom door, and found the boys. Police and medical staff transported Allyson to hospital. Once stabilized, she was transferred to Alberta Hospital Edmonton for psychiatric care pending charges. Funerals for the boys drew large crowds from across central Alberta. Allyson was charged with second-degree murder, 2 counts. From the outset, the case turned on intent and state of mind. Could the Crown prove she meant to cause death, or knew death was likely, versus a lesser but still criminal level of responsibility? At a judge-alone trial before Justice Michelle Crichton, the Crown presented the sequence. 2 children found. In the tub, Allyson's later leap from an overpass, and relationship breakdown preceding the deaths. Allyson testified to memory gaps around the killings, but acknowledged attempts to harm herself that same weekend. The judge found reasonable doubt on intent for murder and convicted her of manslaughter on both counts. On June 4, 2012, Justice Crichton imposed 6 years imprisonment, concurrent, then applied enhanced credit for more than 2 years of pretrial and psychiatric custody, leaving approximately 15 months to serve in a secure hospital setting. Alberta public officials criticized the effective remaining time as too lenient, and the Alberta Crown appealed, seeking a new trial or convictions for second-degree murder. After roughly 10 months of post-sentencing hospital custody, Allyson was deported to Australia on April 9-10, 2013, arriving in Sydney to a media scrum. Alberta's Justice Minister publicly objected, but was unable to prevent removal. The Crown's appeal of the manslaughter outcome remained active in Canada. In mid-September 2013, Australian authorities confirmed Allyson had been found deceased beneath a bridge near Gosford, north of Sydney. Canadian and Australian outlets reported her death. Alberta's ongoing effort to bring her back for a rehearing ended there. The McConnell case sits at the intersection of family collapse, mental health crisis, and the limits of criminal law. A judge concluded the evidence didn't prove murder-level intent beyond a reasonable doubt, yet 2 children were gone, and their father discovered them himself. The sentence, 6 years with substantial time-served credit, ignited debate across Alberta about proportionality, hospital custody versus prison, and whether deportation undercut the Crown's pending appeal. Elaine Campione, Barrie, Ontario, 2006. When police stepped into a small apartment in Barrie, Ontario, on October 3, 2006, they found something no one could ever forget. 2 little girls, Serena, just 3 years old, and her baby sister Sophia, 19 months, were lying side by side on a bed. Each wore matching pink pajamas. Each had a small necklace around her neck. A video camera sat on a nearby table, still recording. On the tape was their mother, Elaine Campione, speaking softly to the children's father, Leo. It was calm, almost rehearsed. But what the officers were looking at was the aftermath of one of the most heartbreaking crimes in Canadian memory. Elaine Frances Campione was born in 1973 in New Brunswick. By her late 20s, she had moved to Ontario, where she met Leo Campione, a man she'd later marry. Together, they had 2 daughters, Serena and Sophia, who quickly became the center of her world. But by 2005, the marriage had fallen apart. Friends and relatives described tension, arguments, and an ongoing court battle over custody. Elaine was struggling, emotionally, financially, and physically. She had spoken to doctors about depression and anxiety. At times, she told family members she felt like she was losing control of her life. In the summer of 2006, the children were placed primarily in her care. A new custody hearing was scheduled, and Leo had recently applied for full custody. For weeks, she seemed nervous about losing her daughters, the only people she felt she still had. According to court records, sometime on the evening of October 2nd, Elaine filled the bathtub in her apartment and brought her daughters into the bathroom. What exactly went through her mind that night remains one of Canada's great moral tragedies. After the girls died, Elaine dressed them carefully in clean pajamas, brushed their hair, and laid them together. On the bed, she recorded a message addressed to Leo, speaking directly into the camera. In the video, she appeared eerily calm. She held up the girls' favorite toys, talked about how much she loved them, and said, "They're with me now." Early the next morning, she called 911. Police arrived at the apartment, where they found the children and the recording. Elaine was arrested at the scene and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Neighbors watched as officers escorted her out of the building. She looked dazed, barely responding to questions. In Barrie, a city known more for quiet neighborhoods than national headlines, the news spread fast. Within hours, flowers, stuffed animals, and handwritten notes began appearing outside the building. Residents who had seen Elaine walking the girls to the park only days before struggled to make sense of it. For many, this was the kind of story you only read about, not something that happens in a peaceful Ontario town. Police and Crown prosecutors quickly tied the case to the ongoing custody dispute. In the weeks before the crime, court dates had been set to determine whether Leo would gain full custody. Investigators found that Elaine had written several notes expressing hopelessness and fear about losing her daughters. But they also uncovered evidence of planning: the recording, the jewelry, the messages left behind. The question at the heart of the case wasn't what happened. Everyone knew that. The question was why, and whether Elaine truly understood what she was doing. When the trial began 4 years later in 2010, the courtroom was packed. Elaine, now 35, sat quietly between her lawyers, rarely lifting her eyes. The Crown argued that this was a deliberate act, a form of revenge against her ex-husband. The defense didn't deny that Elaine killed the girls, but claimed she suffered from a severe mental disorder that made her unable to comprehend the moral weight of her actions. The defense called psychiatrists who testified that Elaine was deeply ill, experiencing psychosis, and that in her mind, she believed she was protecting her children from being taken away. But the prosecution countered with experts of their own, who said she was depressed but rational, capable of distinguishing right from wrong. Over 7 weeks, the jury saw dozens of exhibits, the home video, the notes, and testimony from family and doctors. Many jurors were seen quietly wiping tears as the footage was described. On November 15, 2010, after 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict, guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Judge Alfred Stong then imposed the mandatory sentence, life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The judge described the killings as an unspeakable betrayal of maternal trust. Reporters noted that Elaine showed little visible reaction as the verdict was read. Elaine's lawyers appealed the conviction, arguing that the trial judge had not properly instructed the jury on the definition of moral wrongfulness, a key element in cases involving mental disorder defenses. The Ontario Court of Appeal reviewed the case in 2015 under the citation R.V. Campione, 2015 ONCA 67. In its decision, the court upheld the verdict, confirming that the jury had been correctly instructed and that the evidence supported the finding of intent and awareness. That ruling later became a reference point in Canadian law for how courts interpret mental illness in relation to moral understanding. Aftermath. In later years, as part of prison rehabilitation programs, the Parole Board of Canada approved limited escorted temporary absences, short, supervised visits for therapy, and reintegration exercises. These decisions were administrative, not parole, and did not shorten her sentence or affect her 25-year ineligibility. Elaine remains incarcerated today, with her first possible parole application date in 2035. The public's reaction to the Campione case was unlike most others. For some, she was a monster who had turned on her own children. For others, she was a deeply broken woman, failed by a system that couldn't recognize her unraveling in time. What makes this story so haunting isn't just the crime itself. It's how ordinary everything seemed before it happened. A mother trying to keep her family together. A legal fight that escalated beyond repair. A moment when reality and despair collided. Lisa Gibson, Winnipeg, Manitoba, July 2013. A bathtub filled with water, 2 small children, a missing mother. That's what police found inside a quiet suburban home in Winnipeg on July 24, 2013. 2-year-old Anna and 3-month-old Nicholas Gibson had drowned. Their mother, Lisa Gibson, was gone. For 2 days the city searched, police, firefighters, volunteers combing the riverbanks and fields. Then, on July 27th, her body was found floating in the Red River, not far from home. Police confirmed what many feared, a murder-suicide born out of mental collapse. It was a case that shook an entire nation, because it didn't come from hate, but from despair. Lisa Gibson was 32, a pharmacist, and a devoted mother. By all accounts, she loved her children deeply. But after the birth of her second child, she began to show signs of postpartum depression, an illness that can quietly erode judgment and hope. She was seeing a doctor, taking medication, and supported by family. No one thought she was capable of harm. Her husband, Philip Gibson, had left home that morning for errands. When he returned less than an hour later, everything was silent. He went upstairs calling her name. The bathroom door was partly open, water still running. Inside were Anna and Nicholas. He called 911 immediately. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but the children could not be saved. Lisa's car was gone. Police launched a province-wide search, fearing she was in danger herself. Helicopters traced the riverbanks, officers canvassed the area, and news outlets issued urgent alerts. 2 days later, on July 27th, a passerby walking along the Red River spotted a body near the Alexander docks. Police confirmed it was Lisa Gibson. The Winnipeg Police Service officially classified the case as a homicide-suicide. The Manitoba medical examiner later announced that no inquest would be held. The facts were clôturés, and no further legal process was required. The tragedy stunned Winnipeg. Outside the Gibson home, flowers, toys, and candles filled the steps. Strangers left notes that read, "Rest in peace, little angels," and "We wish we could have helped." At a joint funeral for Lisa, Anna, and Nicholas, hundreds of mourners gathered. Her husband, Philip Gibson, spoke softly through tears. "Lisa loved our children more than life itself. This was not the woman we knew. It was the illness that took over." In the months that followed, medical professionals and advocacy groups used the tragedy as a turning point for awareness. They emphasized the importance of early postpartum screening, continuous follow-up care, and breaking stigma around mental health for new mothers. Manitoba's health system expanded nurse visits and crisis line resources, small steps meant to prevent another family from facing the same fate. Lisa Gibson's story haunts people because it could happen anywhere. A loving mother, a young family, a life that looked perfect from the outside. It reminds us that mental illness doesn't always shout for help. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it smiles, and sometimes it ends in silence. Penny Boudreau, Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, 2008. On a cold January night in 2008, a worried mother stood before local TV cameras in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, begging for help. Her 12-year-old daughter, Carissa, had vanished, she said, simply gone while she'd stepped out of the car for a few minutes. Police joined the search. Neighbors brought flashlights. Posters appeared on every lamppost in town. But when Carissa's body was found 2 weeks later beside the La Have River, investigators realized the person pleading for help wasn't looking for her daughter. She was hiding what she had done. This is the story of Penny Boudreau, a case that broke Nova Scotia's heart and forced the country to ask how love could twist into something this dark. Penny Patricia Boudreau was born in 1974 and raised in Nova Scotia's South Shore region. By her early 30s, she was a single mother raising Carissa, her only child. Those who knew them described a typical small-town family. Penny worked odd jobs and lived quietly, while Carissa attended junior high, a smart, outspoken girl who loved animals and wrote in her diary about wanting to be a veterinarian. In 2007, Penny began dating a local mechanic named Vernon McCumber. By all accounts, the relationship was troubled. Arguments were frequent, and there were complaints about Carissa's behavior at home. In court later, prosecutors said Penny feared McCumber might leave her if family life didn't improve, that she believed her daughter was standing in the way of keeping the relationship together. McCumber, however, denied ever issuing any ultimatum. Whatever the truth, tension inside the small apartment grew in the weeks leading up to January 2008. On the evening of January 27, 2008, Penny drove with Carissa toward the outskirts of Bridgewater. According to the agreed statement of facts later read aloud in court, Penny stopped the car on a dirt road near the riverbank. There, she attacked her daughter and used a piece of cord to end her life. Afterward, she staged a scene to make it look as though Carissa had vanished. She left the girl's boots nearby to imply that she'd wandered off in the snow. At 8:30 that night, Penny called police, reporting that her daughter had gone missing while she was briefly away from the vehicle. By the next morning, Bridgewater was mobilized. Search teams combed through wooded areas, volunteers canvassed door to door, and media outlets aired urgent bulletins. Penny appeared on camera, distraught, pleading for information. At the time, no one imagined the mother standing in front of microphones was also the prime suspect. For nearly 2 weeks, Bridgewater lived in fear. Residents locked doors, checked in on their children, and speculated about an abduction. The search stretched miles along the La Have River. RCMP divers examined ice-covered sections of shoreline. Provincial emergency crews joined in as temperatures dropped to 15 degrees. Then, on February 9, 2008, a passerby walking near Conquerall Bank, a rural area outside town, spotted something down a steep embankment, a body partially covered by snow. Police soon confirmed what the town had dreaded. It was Carissa Boudreau. Within hours, the mood shifted from hope to heartbreak. Candles and flowers appeared outside Bridgewater Junior High. Carissa's classmates left notes that read, "You didn't deserve this," and "Rest easy, sweet girl." But quietly, behind the scenes, investigators began looking closer at Penny's story. Bridgewater Police and the RCMP formed a joint task force. Almost immediately, inconsistencies in Penny's statements stood out. Timelines that didn't align, minor details that changed with each retelling. To test her story, officers launched an undercover operation, a strategy known in Canadian policing as a Mr. Big Sting, designed to elicit confessions through long-term contact with an undercover operative posing as part of a criminal network. Over several meetings, Penny confided to the operatives that she had taken her daughter's life and explained why. These confessions, captured on hidden recording devices, matched forensic findings at the scene. When investigators confronted her with the evidence, Penny broke down. In June 2008, she was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. News of the arrest shocked the province. For a small town that had prayed for closure, it was a gut punch. The realization that the person everyone had sympathized with had caused the tragedy herself. In January 2009, Penny Boudreau appeared in the Nova Scotia Supreme Court. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and friends of the victim. She wore plain clothes and spoke softly when she entered a plea of guilty to second-degree murder. As part of the plea agreement, prosecutors read aloud the facts of the case, the drive, the argument, and the staged disappearance. The Crown said the act was planned to remove the child from what Penny saw as an obstacle to her relationship. Justice Margaret Stewart accepted the plea and delivered the mandatory sentence, life imprisonment with no eligibility for parole for 20 years. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, Penny whispered, "I'm sorry," before being led away. In the gallery, Carissa's relatives sat in silence. Some wept, others turned away. Outside, the child's father, Paul Boudreau, told reporters that no sentence would bring back his daughter, but that he hoped others would see this as a warning about what happens when anger and desperation take over. The aftermath of the case left deep scars across Nova Scotia. Bridgewater, a town of fewer than 10,000 people, had never experienced a crime like this. Residents who had searched the woods now felt betrayed. Local volunteers described nightmares and guilt, feeling they had tried to save a child from the very person who took her. After her conviction, Penny was sent to the Nova Institution for Women in Truro, Nova Scotia. For years, she maintained a low profile, participating in counseling and faith-based programs. Under the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, inmates serving life sentences can apply for escorted temporary absences, short, supervised outings for therapy or religious services, long before they become eligible for parole. In 2019, the Parole Board of Canada first approved limited escorted visits to a local church. These were not signs of release, only rehabilitative permissions under strict supervision. Then, in April 2024, new reports confirmed additional supervised visits, which again sparked public anger and confusion about what those permissions meant. In June 2025, the board denied day parole, but granted a 60-day unescorted temporary absence, allowing her to visit the community under specified conditions. Still far from freedom, but enough to reignite national debate about rehabilitation versus justice. Every time her name resurfaced in the news, Nova Scotians relived the pain. Some argued that rehabilitation was part of Canada's justice system, and that even those who commit horrific crimes can change. Others said certain acts, especially those against one's own child, should forfeit that possibility forever. The story of Penny and Carissa isn't just about jealousy or desperation. It's about the terrifying fragility of control, how one moment of panic, one distorted belief, can turn love into violence. Samantha Kematch, Manitoba, the Phoenix Sinclair case, 2005. When RCMP officers entered a cluttered apartment in Fisher River, Manitoba in 2006, they were looking for a 5-year-old girl who hadn't been seen in months. Her name was Phoenix Sinclair, a bright, giggling child known to neighbors for her big smile and tiny pink backpack. What investigators uncovered instead was a chilling revelation. Phoenix had been dead for almost a year, her body buried in a shallow grave near a garbage dump. Her mother, Samantha Kematch, and Kematch's partner, Carl McKay, had continued collecting welfare checks and living as though nothing had happened. It would take another 2 years for the courts to deliver a verdict, and almost a decade for Manitoba to reckon with how a 5-year-old girl could vanish in plain sight. Phoenix Sinclair was born on April 23, 2000, in Winnipeg. Her early life was marked by instability, neglect, and frequent interventions from Manitoba's Child and Family Services, CFS. Reports later revealed that Phoenix was taken into foster care multiple times during her first few years, sometimes for months at a stretch, only to be returned to her parents despite warnings about unsafe conditions. Her mother, Samantha Kematch, born in 1975, had a troubled history of her own. She grew up in foster care, dropped out of school young, and battled poverty, isolation, and substance dependency. By 2004, she was living with Carl McKay, a man with a violent past and a known temper. That same year, Phoenix was returned to her mother's custody for what would tragically be the final time. Within months of being reunited, Phoenix's life deteriorated behind closed doors. Witnesses later told police and social workers that they rarely saw the child outside. When they did, she seemed thin, bruised, and afraid to speak. McKay and Kematch isolated her from the world, forcing her to call them Mom and Dad while referring to herself as a bad girl. Investigators would later uncover a pattern of ongoing mistreatment and starvation. In June 2005, Phoenix was beaten repeatedly and confined to a cold basement in their home in Fisher River First Nation, about 200 kilometers north of Winnipeg. One assault proved fatal. According to court records, Phoenix died sometime between June 11 and June 15, 2005. Instead of calling for help, Kematch and McKay wrapped her small body in plastic and buried her near the local landfill. They told friends that Phoenix was living with relatives. For the next 9 months, they continued to cash benefit checks and move between communities without raising suspicion. Phoenix's death remained unknown to the authorities until March 2006, when a relative contacted police after realizing no one had seen or heard from the child in nearly a year. RCMP launched a missing person investigation that quickly turned into something far darker. On March 27, 2006, after questioning both suspects, investigators were led to a remote spot near the Fisher River dump site. There, beneath the snow and frozen soil, they found human remains, later confirmed through DNA testing to be Phoenix Sinclair. The discovery sent shockwaves through Manitoba. Officers described it as one of the most disturbing scenes they had ever encountered. The public demanded to know how a 5-year-old could vanish from the care of her mother and go unnoticed by the very system meant to protect her. Police arrested Samantha Kematch and Carl McKay that same week. They were charged with first-degree murder and forcible confinement. Both were denied bail and held in custody pending trial. News of the arrests spread across Canada, and for months, the child's photo appeared in every major newspaper. In that photo, Phoenix was smiling, missing her 2 front teeth, a reminder of the childhood she never truly got to have. The trial began in December 2007 and continued into 2008. The evidence presented was overwhelming. Witnesses, including former friends and neighbors, testified that McKay and Kematch had treated Phoenix as less than human. One neighbor told the court they heard crying and what sounded like punishment rituals, locking the child in a basement for hours without food. The Crown argued that Phoenix's death was deliberate, not a moment of rage, but a sustained campaign of cruelty. They said Kematch and McKay had taken on a twisted, disciplinary role, subjecting the little girl to psychological and physical torment until she died. Defense lawyers, in contrast, attempted to argue diminished capacity and emotional instability, but the jury, was unmoved. On December 12, 2008, both Samantha Kematch and Carl McKay were found guilty of first-degree murder and forcible confinement. They were each sentenced to life imprisonment with no eligibility for parole for 25 years, the maximum penalty in Canada. The judge described the case as one of the most horrific examples of child abuse ever brought before a Canadian court. Even after the trial, questions lingered. How had so many warning signs been missed? Why had Child and Family Services returned Phoenix to her mother's care, despite repeated concerns from social workers and foster parents? The public outrage led to the creation of the Phoenix Sinclair Inquiry, one of the most comprehensive child welfare reviews in Canadian history. The inquiry began in 2011 and ran for nearly 3 years. Testimony from more than 120 witnesses, including social workers, police officers, and family members, exposed a chain of systemic failures, overworked caseworkers, poor record-keeping, and inadequate follow-ups. The inquiry's final report, released in January 2014, concluded that the child welfare system had failed Phoenix at every level. It documented how her case files had been closed without sufficient checks, how welfare visits were missed, and how warnings were ignored. The Manitoba government publicly apologized and pledged reforms, increasing oversight, introducing new case management systems, and hiring additional frontline workers. The story of Phoenix Sinclair isn't just about one mother's cruelty, it's about a society's silence. Her death forced Canada to look hard at the failures of its child protection system, to ask how bureaucracy and complacency could allow a 5-year-old to die unnoticed. Katrina Effort, Wetaskiwin, Alberta, 2005. When neighbors in Wetaskiwin, Alberta, saw paramedics rush into a small suburban home in April 2005, they assumed it was a medical emergency. What they didn't know was that inside that house, a newborn boy had been found dead, hidden in the backyard, wrapped in towels, and tossed over a fence. The child's mother was 19-year-old Katrina Effort, a quiet teenager who had concealed her pregnancy from everyone around her, including her parents. What followed would ignite one of the most debated legal cases in Canada, one that challenged how courts define infanticide, mental state, and accountability in moments of psychological collapse. Katrina Effort grew up in a modest Wetaskiwin household about 70 kilometers south of Edmonton. She was described as shy, polite, and hard-working, a teenager who kept to herself and rarely got into trouble. By 2004, she was working part-time and living with her parents. Unknown to anyone, she became pregnant. Throughout those 9 months, she successfully hid the pregnancy under loose clothing, avoiding suspicion from family, co-workers, and even friends. Later court records confirmed she never sought prenatal care, and her parents remained completely unaware. According to testimony and medical evidence, Katrina gave birth alone in her bedroom late at night. Her parents were asleep in the next room. Moments after delivery, she placed a towel around the newborn boy's neck and strangled him. She later wrapped the baby in more towels, tied them with elastic bands, and left him in the backyard, tossing the body over a fence into a neighbor's yard. The next morning, she went about her day as if nothing had happened. It wasn't until 2 days later, when she visited a doctor complaining of pain and heavy bleeding, that staff realized she had recently given birth. They contacted police immediately. RCMP officers found the infant's remains that same day. Katrina was arrested at the hospital and charged with second-degree murder and indignity to a dead body. From the start, the case divided public opinion. Some viewed her actions as cold and premeditated. Others saw a young woman in shock and denial. Psychiatric assessments, ordered by the court, described her as emotionally immature, overwhelmed, and suffering from postpartum psychological distress, though not legally insane. In 2006, a jury at the Court of Queen's Bench in Wetaskiwin found Katrina guilty of second-degree murder, sentencing her to life imprisonment with no parole eligibility for 10 years. But the trial left lingering concerns. Had the jury properly considered Canada's infanticide law, which recognizes diminished responsibility when a mother's mind is disturbed after childbirth? Her defense appealed the verdict, arguing the evidence of mental instability and shock should have been central, not dismissed as an afterthought. In 2009, the Alberta Court of Appeal set aside the murder conviction and ordered a new trial, ruling that the jury instructions failed to adequately explain the lesser charge of infanticide. The case returned to court in 2011, this time heard by Justice Joanne Veit. After reviewing medical testimony and the original forensic evidence, Justice Veit concluded that Effort's actions, while tragic, fit the legal definition of infanticide, not murder. She stated in her written decision, Katrina Effort's mind was disturbed by the effects of giving birth, rendering her culpability diminished at the time of the act. The new verdict substituted infanticide for the previous murder conviction. Her sentence, 3 years probation and a suspended sentence, meaning no jail time. The ruling sparked nationwide debate. Many Canadians were outraged by what they saw as leniency for the death of a newborn. Headlines across the country read, "No jail for mother who killed her baby." Under Section 233 of the Criminal Code, a woman who causes the death of her newborn by a willful act or omission while her mind is disturbed by the effects of giving birth or lactation can be found guilty of infanticide, a charge carrying a maximum of 5 years in prison. The Effort case became the most high-profile test of this statute in decades. It underscored a legal tension, balancing empathy for mental disturbance against the expectation of accountability. Following the verdict, the Alberta Crown reviewed the case but did not appeal to the Supreme Court. Effort completed her probation without incident and withdrew from public life. Her case has since become a touchstone in Canadian criminal law courses, often cited when discussing the difference between murder, manslaughter, and infanticide, and how courts interpret mental disturbance in postpartum cases. Meredith Borowiec, Calgary, Alberta, 2008-2010. In October 2010, a Calgary apartment resident heard faint cries coming from a dumpster behind their building. When they went to investigate, they found a newborn baby, wrapped in towels, barely alive, and left among the trash. That child survived. When police traced the origin of the voice and the evidence, they arrived at the apartment of Meredith Borowiec, a 27-year-old woman who showed little emotion when confronted. But what investigators didn't know at that moment was that this was not her first newborn. 2 others, from previous pregnancies in 2008 and 2009, had been discarded the same way, and neither had survived. The case that followed would expose a pattern of hidden births, shock even veteran detectives, and lead to a Supreme Court ruling that redefined how Canada interprets the crime of infanticide. Meredith Borowiec was born and raised in Calgary, Alberta. Friends and neighbors later described her as quiet, reserved, and seemingly responsible. She lived with her longtime partner and worked at a call center. To those around her, there were no signs of turmoil, no visible pregnancies, no indications of distress. But behind closed doors, Borowiec was concealing an extraordinary secret. Between 2008 and 2010, she became pregnant 3 times and successfully hid every pregnancy from family, friends, and her partner. Court records later revealed that she wore loose clothing and avoided social gatherings during late stages of pregnancy, claiming illness or long work hours. On October 19, 2010, a resident of the apartment complex where Borowiec lived heard a baby crying near the garbage bins. The resident looked inside a dumpster and found a newborn boy wrapped in a towel, umbilical cord still attached. The baby was rushed to Foothills Medical Center, where doctors confirmed he was only hours old but stable. Police quickly canvassed the area, interviewing tenants and collecting surveillance footage. By evening, investigators focused on Borowiec's unit. A short time later, they found traces of blood in the bathroom and hallway consistent with recent childbirth. She was arrested that night and charged with attempted murder and abandoning a child. During questioning, Borowiec at first denied any knowledge of the child, but as detectives presented the forensic evidence, she admitted the newborn was hers, and then she went further. She told police this was not the first time she had given birth in secret. In both 2008 and 2009, she said she had delivered infants alone in her bathroom, placed them in bags, and left them in the garbage. Both babies died shortly after birth. According to the official agreed statement of facts later read in court, she stated she panicked each time and believed no one would understand. The bodies of the first 2 infants were never recovered. After the confession, Borowiec was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder for the deaths of the 2008 and 2009 infants and attempted murder for the 2010 child who survived. The Crown argued that her actions were intentional and that concealing multiple pregnancies showed planning and awareness. The defense countered that Borowiec's mind was disturbed following childbirth, the exact condition described in Canada's infanticide law, and that she had acted in panic and confusion, not calculated malice. Psychiatric evaluations ordered by the court found that she was not psychotic, but likely suffering from acute dissociation and emotional detachment immediately after giving birth. The case went before the Court of King's Bench of Alberta, then Queen's Bench, in Calgary. In November 2014, after lengthy proceedings, Justice Peter McIntyre found Borowiec guilty of 2 counts of infanticide for the deaths of her first 2 infants and acquitted her of attempted murder for the surviving 2010 baby. The judge ruled that her mental state during the acts fit the legal definition of infanticide, that her mind was disturbed by the physiological and emotional effects of giving birth. Justice McIntyre stated, "While her actions were deliberate, they were carried out by a woman whose judgment and reason were impaired by the aftermath of childbirth." Her sentence, 18 months in custody, followed by 3 years of probation. The Crown appealed, arguing that the trial judge had misapplied the law by treating the mental disturbance too broadly. The case reached the Supreme Court of Canada in 2016 under the name R. v. Borowiec, 2016 SCC 11. In a unanimous decision written by Justice Michael Moldaver, the court upheld the conviction. The case drew widespread attention for both its horror and its complexity. Many Canadians were shocked by the lenient sentence, while legal analysts defended it as a faithful application of existing law. Meredith Borowiec completed her sentence and was released under supervision. Her name largely disappeared from public view after 2016, and Alberta's Justice Ministry later confirmed she had complied with all probation conditions. Shirley Jane Turner, Newfoundland Labrador, August 18, 2003. At around 1:30 a.m. on August 18, 2003, a jogger in Conception Bay South, Newfoundland, spotted something in the water near a small fishing wharf. When police arrived, they found the bodies of a mother and her 13-month-old son floating face down in the Atlantic. The child was Zachary Turner. His mother was Dr. Shirley Jane Turner, a physician facing extradition to the United States for the murder of Zachary's father. It was later confirmed that Shirley had drugged her baby, strapped him to her chest with a sweater, and jumped into the ocean. The case would become one of the most infamous failures of the Canadian justice system, not just because of what happened that night, but because it should never have been possible. Shirley Jane Turner was born in 1961 in St. Anthony, Newfoundland. Bright and ambitious, she pursued a career in medicine, studying in Newfoundland, and later completing residency programs in the United States. In the late 1990s, while working in Iowa and later Pennsylvania, she began a relationship with Dr. Andrew Bagby, a fellow physician. The relationship was volatile, marked by intense attachment and repeated breakups. In 2001, after Andrew ended the relationship for good, Turner drove from Iowa to Pennsylvania, a trip of more than 1,500 kilometers, and confronted him outside his workplace. The next morning, Andrew Bagby was found shot 5 times in a park near Latrobe, Pennsylvania. Police quickly identified Shirley Turner as the prime suspect. Her car had been seen in the area, and phone records showed multiple calls to Andrew's home and workplace the night before the killing. By the time U.S. authorities obtained a warrant, Turner had fled to Newfoundland, returning to her hometown of St. John's. In December 2001, Canadian police arrested her under a U.S. extradition request. While awaiting extradition hearings, she revealed that she was pregnant with Andrew's child. That revelation drastically complicated the case. Prosecutors in both countries agreed to postpone extradition proceedings until after the baby's birth. On July 18, 2002, Shirley gave birth to a boy she named Zachary Andrew Turner. Andrew's parents, David and Kathleen Bagby, immediately applied for custody, fearing for the child's safety. For the next year, what followed was a bitter legal struggle between the Bagbys, who wanted to raise their grandson, and Shirley, who remained the primary guardian despite being charged with murder. Despite objections from the U.S. government and warnings from police, Newfoundland courts released Shirley Turner on bail, first in 2002 and again in 2003, pending extradition. Officials cited that she was not a flight risk and had no prior violent convictions in Canada. She was ordered to attend counseling and check in regularly with authorities. In practice, supervision was minimal. She retained custody of Zachary and was allowed unrestricted visitation with him. David and Kathleen Bagby, though terrified, complied with court orders and maintained a cautious relationship with Shirley so they could see their grandson. By mid-2003, extradition to the U.S. was again moving forward. Turner had been ordered to surrender to authorities in the coming weeks. On the night of August 17, 2003, she gave Zachary a lethal dose of prescription medication, secured him to her chest with a sweater, and walked into the waters of Conception Bay. Their bodies were recovered the next morning. Investigators later determined the child had been rendered unconscious before entering the water. Both were pronounced dead at the scene. Public outrage followed immediately. How could a woman accused of first-degree murder in another country have been released on bail and allowed to keep custody of her infant son? The tragedy prompted a full-scale review by the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate of Newfoundland and Labrador. In October 2006, the province released the Turner Review and Investigation, a 3-volume report documenting every missed warning and bureaucratic failure. Key findings included insufficient risk assessment during bail hearings, failure to communicate between Canadian and American authorities, lack of child protection coordination even after multiple red flags. The report concluded that Zachary Turner's death was preventable and called for sweeping reform of bail and child protection procedures in cases involving serious charges. Following the Turner Review, Newfoundland and Labrador revised its child protection protocols, requiring joint reviews between justice and social services whenever a parent is charged with a serious violent offense. The case also fueled changes to Canada's bail review process, emphasizing child safety considerations during release applications. Zachary's grandparents, David and Kathleen Bagby, became outspoken advocates for reform. Their 2007 book, Dance with the Devil, A Doctor's Death, A Mother's Betrayal, and a Baby's Murder, chronicled the systemic collapse that led to Zachary's death. Their story later inspired the acclaimed 2008 documentary, Dear Zachary, a letter to a son about his father. Across Canada, these stories of mothers who became killers continue to shake us because they strike at the heart of what we believe in: family, love, and protection. Each of these cases is a reminder that tragedy doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it begins at home, hidden behind a familiar smile or a quiet street we may meet. We fully understand what turns a caregiver into a destroyer, but by talking about it, by remembering these children, we make sure their stories aren't lost to silence. Tell me in the comments what you think. How do you make sense of mothers who take the lives they once gave? And if you want more verified true crime stories from across Canada, subscribe to Redacted Minutes for daily content that keeps these conversations alive.